Well, hello, Leeds United fans. I hope you're all doing really well. It's Connor. We're back here with another video today. As I say, I really want your thoughts on this. I'm going to make it a concise version of what me and Joe were talking about earlier on. I want to tell you guys my exact thoughts when it comes to the profile of this individual, where we need to go with him, my worries, my concerns, but also the positives. And I'm going to make this sort of a bit of a sandwich of events, really, and discuss the overall picture, the filling, and then the end point, really, of Leeds United and Brendan Aaronson. So for me, this is an interesting one above all, really, because it could be quite symbolic of what Leeds United do. Now, the Daniel Farke system, and before we start this, everybody, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the video from earlier on, then the video with Joe as well. There's loads of content flying at you from all Leeds United angles on the channel. I think the Daniel Farke system is going to be interesting here because maybe we're going to a scenario of which we're not all very familiar. And let me explain that to you right now. So at Norwich, I've mentioned before, he played with 210s in Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia. I've mentioned before his record with Emi Buendia wasn't great, and this could be quite symptomatic of Leeds United potentially without Christensen Somerville. The fascinating thing here is with Brendan Aaronson coming back into the picture and Leeds playing a 4-2-3-1 system, he could very, very, very easily mould into one of those number 10s. Breaking down a low block, I think he's going to aid this massively. I think Dan James has aided this massively as well. And I think really simply it can come down to 1-2s. It can come to players breaking the lines and making those runs. But, you know, the more technically able players being able to find those individuals and breaking that offside trap and moving between the left back and the centre back and the right back. I think someone like Brendan Aaronson would aid that massively. We've seen Daniel James aid that in mass capacity. I think the fans that have their own opinion on Dan James not getting to, Brendan Aaronson not getting to Dan James' level, that's fine. I sincerely disagree with you. Can you sincerely disagree with someone? I definitely disagree with you in terms of the ability. I don't think Dan James has a mass technical ability which hugely outweighs that of Brendan Aaronson. I'd say they're similar on ball striking ability. I'd say they're similar with both feet. I'd say the similar ball carriers. I think there's a lot of similarities between Dan James and Brendan Aaronson, but I'd say there was probably more upside to Brendan Aaronson's game, which has obviously been recognised by many, which, you know, Leeds United paid 30 million quid for the guy. They paid 25 million quid for Dan James, of course. And I think there are similarities there in terms of the career, both needing a bit of a step down to make a step up. But I don't think either are technically graceful players, if I put it that way, in terms of your Jorginho Rutters and your Christensen Somerville and your Willian Yontos. But I think they both have their advantages. And I think he's probably the biggest comparison to what Brendan Aaronson could be at this level. And I think people saying that Dan James is way ahead of Brendan Aaronson are completely wrong and false on that. And I think there is a trajectory and a ceiling for Brendan Aaronson at this level. I think it's a smart move for him coming back to Leeds United and thinking to himself, I need to step down to get further forward in my career, because he's nowhere near, at this moment in time, a Premier League player. He's nowhere near, in my opinion, a fully fledged and effective Bundesliga player. I think if Leeds would have received offers, it might have been from a Dusseldorf, it might have been from a Kaiserslautern, it might have been offers of that level. He was obviously offered several by German clubs, according to reports. So I think there's context to be applied here. Leeds rejecting bids, or Brendan Aaronson saying that he didn't want to go out on loan again. Him coming back, him being in an environment with Daniel Farke, who maybe there's a little bit of a German link there. I know Brendan's not German, everybody, before you jump on that, but he's played in that league now. Will Farke be able to nurture that like he did at Norwich with several players who'd played in the Bundesliga previously? He's obviously managed Dortmund too as well. And I think you've got to look at the synergy here between both. I think the player in Brendan Aaronson, he's not going to cause any trouble. I think he's going to be a very straightforward, straight-laced guy who goes about his business and comes out in interviews and praises the club and is very, easy to manage, which I think Daniel Farke likes, that type of player. I think when you look at the 4-2-3-1 system, I think there's a real ability there for Brendan Aaronson to be able to mould into potentially three roles in behind the striker. I think that works. I think you've just got to look at how this has worked for many other players. Junior Firpo, Dan James probably being the standouts, but I've mentioned previously Jorginho Rutter and Crysencio Somerville, albeit they're on very different levels. The step down has helped them. There is no way Rutter, there is no way Somerville will have had the same level of season if they were in the Premier League, because the level's too high. And it's a definite positive thing and a beneficiary to those two that have been able to step down to then level up their game. Now, the obvious examples being Junior Firpo and Dan James were nowhere near good enough. Fans just loved Dan James, and have always loved Dan James because of his effort and his endeavour and his I do believe he's a very Leeds United type player, and I think you'll all know that if you're Leeds United fans. I think Brendan Aaronson was very much like that. I do. I just don't think that he was able to get to that level that Dan James has been able to get to, because he's not had the step down. Now, let's get to some of the negatives that you're going to have to associate with someone like Dan James. It's the lack of composure. It's the length of time he spends on the ball, and albeit it is the physicality aspect. Now, I was very, very, very disappointed, I have to say, to go to when he went to Union Berlin, and he's been signed for such big money at Leeds United. And maybe there was a bit of a, I don't need to do this. I've been signed for this sort of money. I'm playing in the Premier League. I'm playing for the US men's national team. He went to Berlin. He was dropped from the US men's national team. He was very, very inconsistent. He got 2 90-minute appearances all season for Union Berlin. And my biggest disappointment overall was his lack of physical development. Now, I think even in the Bundesliga, which is a top league, top 5 league in Europe, you have to at least work on yourself in the offseason. He didn't do that. He didn't work on himself in the offseason at Leeds United. I think that's quite arrogant. I think you've got to do that. I think you've got to work on your flaws. Maybe he tried to do that and he wasn't able to get to that level. But we're not talking about a small, diminutive player here whose ability on the ball is able to get him out of those physical deficiencies. He has to have them because he's constantly involved in physical battles in the middle of the field. He's constantly involving himself with the scrappy nature of football in that middle part of the pitch, which would help Leeds. Of course it would, in terms of a pressing aspect and an energy aspect. But overall, I think that side of his game has to be developed at any level. He's got to start staying on his feet a lot more. Look, sounds basic, but it's true. But there is an upside. There is an upward trajectory here when it comes to Brendan Aaronson, especially at championship level. Championship level isn't the greatest. And when you've potentially got a pressing presence of Dan James, Brendan Aaronson, whoever sticks around at Leeds United in that front sort of 4, 5, 6, if the midfielder get involved in a unit, that's encouraging. The big problem here for me is if Leeds United decide to utilise a Brendan Aaronson and then not develop in the attacking areas. The other attacking areas I'm talking about number 10 here. I'm talking about depth going forward. I'm talking about replacing the technically gifted players in the offensive part of our game, i.e. Crysencio Somerville, and almost replacing him with Brendan Aaronson in terms of like for like. I understand they play different part of the pitch. There's an argument Aaronson's a cam or a ram, or you could put him as a lamb. But I just think overall you can't replace just pure technical ability with just effort and energy. And I understand Brendan's going to look a lot better at this level, as Dan James did. But Dan James in this Leeds United side for the full season would not be able to replicate what Crysencio Somerville did. It just would not happen because Crysencio Somerville has an elevated technical ability, and you have to have that player or one or two of those players in a championship side to get to the Premier League. You have to have a player like that, or a couple, or maybe 3 players like that in a Daniel Farke team, because throughout his entire management career, he has relied on absolute technical ballers. He has. Look, throughout his entire career at management from Dortmund too, there are technically efficient players in there that have almost, the team's been built around. Brendan Aaronson isn't that. Dan James isn't that. Bamford isn't that. Perot isn't that, in my opinion. You know, Matteo Joseph isn't that. He's not your Samu Saiz, your Emi Buendia, your Pablo Hernandez. He's not that. And if Leeds are moving to a 4-2-3-1 formation with maybe 2 10s or more 10s in and around that striker role, of which maybe Aaronson's comprising as one of those sort of modified number 10s, we have to have much more technically able footballers out there with your Brendan Aaronsons, with your Dan James. It can't just be effort, energy, running. It's got to be more than that. And I think that gets you out of this division. So I'm hoping this doesn't mean now that Leeds United we're going to rely on this now. Aaronson comes back and he's the man. I hope we still do a lot more around the technically gifted players in our side. We know Somerville's going to go on. We know Nonto's going to be arcing for a move. You have to replace that, not just with running around with the greatest of respect, but also the end product. Because what I would say last season is the problem with someone like Brendan Aaronson coming in is he does slow play down. He will take 8 touches when you need 4. And that was the whole problem last season. Teams were able to get into their unit, get into their shape ahead of Leeds United because we were too slow on the ball in certain phases. And it would speed up when you get Somerville and Rutter doing the 1-2s, and it would sort of, we'll be able to manipulate space around those 2 players. If one of those 2 players isn't there, you're not going to get that style of football because one of them isn't there in terms of that technically able footballer who's able to do wonderful things with the football. You've got to really think about a different way of playing. Aaronson's nowhere near a Todd Cantwell in terms of player. They're not similar whatsoever. And he's nowhere near an Emi Buendia in terms of caliber, quality, but also style of player either. Completely different. So it's interesting here looking at the fact that Daniel Farke has spoken to him. He wants him to stay as well. This could be a really good thing. There's a lot of positives here, but there are a lot of questions as well. I wouldn't say negatives, but questions. Guys, that's my full thoughts on it. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. Fascinated to see what you think on this one. Absolute pleasure. Like, comment, subscribe. Head on over to the Patreon for some bonus content. We'll see you in a bit. Cheers.